We have a great speaker. John Christensen. He's an economist. From the Tax Justice Network.
The Tax Justice Network.
Inspired UK Uncut. Who've done amazing things. So, this is a lot of the mind behind that. So, big up for John Christensen. Yes.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Conscious of what's been said a few minutes ago, if anybody wants any points clarified, please interrupt me. I'll be using the language of economists, okay? I used to work over there. Okay, boo. I'm conscious also of what was being said a few minutes ago about the power of corporations. We have to have a constitutional settlement which allows us to, at the very least, control our taxing rights over major corporations. So when we start talking about the British Constitution and a new constitutional settlement, can I begin by saying we need to think about Britain's overseas territories and Britain's crown dependencies, because these are the tax havens where the big corporations avoid paying tax, avoid regulation, avoid democratic control. And they happen to be British. And they happen to have a shared feature, which is their head of state is our head of state. It is the Queen. And she has so far failed to in any way exert any of her constitutional responsibilities to rein in the irresponsible behaviour of British Crown dependencies and overseas territories. And when I talk about tax havens and separate states like Crown dependencies and overseas territories, I also want to flag up the state within the state here, just down the road, 2.5 miles east of where we're sitting at the moment. There is a state which is separate from our constitutional settlement, which is the City of London Corporation. The City of London Corporation is a separate state, believe it or not. It has its own government, its own laws, its own prerogative rights, its own police force, its own judiciary, would you believe? In other words, it is a fully functioning state. So we need to talk a little bit about how we finally rein in the powers of the City of London Corporation, which is probably the most successful lobbying corporation in the world. So successful that most of us don't even notice it. So successful that they don't even need to stand for election. Their person who sits inside the House of Commons wasn't elected last week. Their person who sits inside the House of Commons is appointed to sit there with an office of 15 people to support him. He has a name, he has a role, he has a title. The title is the Remembrancer. And the Remembrancer wasn't re-elected this week. He will continue in office, sitting inside Parliament at every single session of Parliament. And he has complete, unmitigated access right the way across both houses. So bear in mind that any constitutional settlement which you wish to come up with has to take account of these extraordinary power bases, the overseas territories, by which I mean places like the Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, and Bermuda, and so on, and the Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. I've been asked to talk about the political economics, where we are at the moment, the big narrative, because it doesn't matter whether it's a change of government. Whichever government is in power in Britain faces a political economy which is dominated by finance and the City of London. despite all the big efforts, all the big discussions in the last 5 years about the march of manufacturers, Britain remains extraordinarily weak in its productive sectors. Our balance of trade deficit has got worse. Our debt has got worse. There is less investment in manufacturing and other productive sectors than there was 10 years ago. We haven't seen a recovery of the economy. And one of the reasons we haven't seen the recovery of the economy was noticeable at 6:30 in the morning on Friday on what was happening on the financial markets. Anybody notice what was happening at 6:30 in the morning? You woke up to the shock of having a Conservative majority government. What was happening on the finance markets?
I was going to say the same thing basically. It bounced right up.
The finance markets, from the moment that Hong Kong opened, sterling was rising, seriously rising against a basket of all other currencies. It's the same bloody house. It's just inflated in value by 3 times. And that's not wealth creation, that's called inflation. That's a disaster. But they talk about the wealth effect over there of rising house prices. There's a confused language. But I think, I dare I say, I'm not going to belittle them, but Treasury has been very, very confused in my lifetime. Partly because their priority is to look after the City of London. The finance curse has made Britain an extremely unattractive place for real investors interested in real productive activity to invest. We underinvested in research and development in our universities. We underinvested in innovation. The City of London is particularly poor at what's called venture capital. It's just not interested in it. If you go to America or go to Germany and look at the credit facilities available to genuine productive capitalism, they're vastly superior to the type of investment the City of London specialises in, which by and large is speculative activity. And you can see that in the way in which so much of their activity is around currency exchange manipulation, property price booms and busts one after the other, commodity booms. That's what the City of London has made its money out of for such a long time. As genuine investors in long-term capitalist production, they're piss poor. And that's been the subject of most of my studies since the 1970s. But the finance curse goes worse than that because the City of London is so powerful that you end up with what's called state capture. The City of London, by and large, shapes our politics. Anybody who goes to the Treasury will be astonished at how many of the people who are working at high level in the Treasury are in fact on secondment from Goldman Sachs or PricewaterhouseCoopers or any of the big banks and accounting firms. Any of the people who've ever worked with any of the senior ministers will be astonished. Ed Balls is a perfect example of this, at how many of his advisory team came out of PricewaterhouseCoopers. In other words, these people were captive to the interests of big business. They set PricewaterhouseCoopers shaped New Labour's tax policies, which are very much geared to the interests of big business and not to the interests of ordinary people. And the Conservatives have been no better at all. They talk about tax cuts, but at the moment they're modelling a 23% increase, an increase to 23% of VAT. That's very possible that within this Parliament you'll see VAT rise to 23%. But they'll present themselves as a tax-cutting party because they will cut taxes. They will cut inheritance taxes, which only impact upon the very rich. They'll cut the top marginal rates, maybe, and they'll cut allowances in many, many areas. So who benefits? The rich will benefit, no question about it. Poorer households will undoubtedly come out of this Parliament very much worse off on the tax arrangements. And we can thank PricewaterhouseCoopers and others for shaping that tax environment. So we have political parties which are very, very closely aligned with the interests of big business, particularly banking business. We have politicians who regularly do what's called a revolving door. They go out of office and go into the City of London sitting on the boards. Anybody know which board Tony Blair left here for?
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan. But this is a very regular occurrence. He's not alone in this. It's astonishing actually how many ministers leave office and go into very, very high-ranking board positions, not because they know all about banking and can contribute anything useful, but because this is payback time. It's as simple as that. I mean, anyone who's worked in the civil service will know that's what politicians, by and large, are looking for.
Can you tell us a little bit about JP Morgan? I heard they're very big and sometimes control some sort of political influence. So.
Well, they are very big, and you've got it absolutely right. You've more or less summed it up. They are very big, and they are very political operators. And they target senior politicians precisely because they want their influence, and they know that once you've got a senior politician on your board, like Tony Blair, it will open doors in governments right the way across the world. Democratic governments like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and so on.
You've also got into corporate revolving doors, haven't you? Like Angela Knight, BBA, Opgem.
That's correct. Yes, indeed. So that's a problem that we all face, and I think it's related to problems like the fact that we don't have a proper system for party political funding. And politics does cost money, but if the money's largely coming from corporations, then for obvious reasons the corporations will expect to have a return on their investments. And there we have a problem. We have captured political parties. I don't think there's a great deal of difference between the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. All of them get a significant proportion of their funding from financial services and related businesses. We have politicians who see office here as a springboard into extremely lucrative positions once they leave office. Again, that's part of state capture. We have extraordinary lobbies, like for example the City of London Corporation, able to operate around Whitehall and to embed their very senior staff on regular long-term secondments into offices right the way across Whitehall. That is all classic part of this process of what we call state capture, and that is part of what's called the finance curse. Over-dependence upon a single sector, whether it's oil and gas in the resource curse, or finance in the case of the finance curse. Over-dependence, too many of our brightest and best people wanting to go there because the salaries and the working conditions are so much better than other sectors can possibly offer. A long-term lack of investment in other sectors. The Dutch disease curse, the Dutch disease effect of having an overpriced currency, which means that you can't export other products, which means long-term investment in other sectors of the economy declines. Does all of that make sense to you?
I'm just thinking this sounds like corruption to me. It just sounds like
That's exactly where I was getting to, because the worst part of the resource curse is inevitably the state becomes captured and corrupted, because everyone wants a slice of their share of the oil and gas pie. Think Libya, think Nigeria.
Reality and seducing us into it.
Absolutely. In the case of the finance curse, the corruption is not quite as upfront. But as you heard from David White earlier on, talking about his book, How Corrupt is Britain, my chapter in that book is called On Her Majesty's Secrecy Service. And that talks about Britain's role as the world's leading tax haven. Not just the City of London, but think about all its satellites. Think about Bermuda, one of the most secretive offshore financial centres in the world. Think about Jersey, which is where I come from. Think about Guernsey, the Isle of Man, the Cayman. If you accumulate all of these tax havens and treat them as one tax haven rather than as individual tax havens, they're much bigger than Luxembourg and much more dangerous than Luxembourg. And they harm the rest of the world on a constant day-in, day-out basis. First of all, because they attract huge amounts of corrupt money. out of the Middle East, out of Russia, out of Africa, out of Latin America. They're all of them designed to enable multinational companies from across the world to not pay tax. They're all of them designed to help the wealthy elites to not pay tax, which means that we lose our democratic control. Democracy is about one thing. At the center of democracy, it lies our ability to raise taxes and spend taxes on what we want.